The events of the weekend mean that there is a lot to discuss. And even though the last Silicon Bites episode was only released a few days ago, there is more than enough to pack into another episode. It seems like world events are spiraling into chaos. We feel assaulted on all sides. It's disorienting and dispiriting when some see patterns where there are none, and others fail to spot patterns behind events that we think are clear. Putin has been content to fan the flames of conflict in the Middle East and elsewhere. Syria is still a Russian killing zone, the slaughter becoming a daily, barely reported occurrence. Death stalks Ukrainian cities and villages from Russian missiles, shells, and bullets. But has Putin opened a can of worms with his overt support for Hamas against Israel? Is this a Pandora's box which, once released, Putin will not be able to control? This episode is not about the war in the Middle East, but it's worth stating some positions clearly to avoid divisive comments and outrage when people do see this episode. As Vlad Vexler and others have eloquently stated in recent videos, it's not enough to simply not target civilians. But any army operating in the field or the air should take every possible measure to avoid civilian casualties. Direct targeting of civilians and civilian infrastructure or failure to mitigate civilian suffering is a war crime. It's simple, and it applies to Palestinians, Israelis, Ukrainians, Syrians, and Russians alike. It's also not helpful to conflate conflicts and causes. To an extent, this is what the Kremlin wants us to do. It wants us to lose focus, lose precision, erode support. For them, indifference and whataboutism is a victory. Inaction is a victory. Confusion is a victory. Ukraine is not Palestine. That is not to diminish the causes and suffering on either side, but the contexts, histories, and situations are different. So too will be the outcomes, as these different conflicts require their own unique resolutions. Well, let's turn to the events in Dagestan, the disturbing events that started to unfold on Sunday evening. And there's a key question: how linked is Russia to the violence and the breakdown of order that we are seeing there? Is it an unforeseen and feared consequence of the Kremlin's long-term policies to destabilize the international order and challenge the rules-based system? Is it a feature, not a bug? And is Russia actively orchestrating the chaos? Now, the KGB has form for organizing such unrest, chaos, and terrorism. We only have to look at the apartment bombings in the early 2000s, the Nord-Ost theater siege, and the Beslan massacre. But it doesn't mean that they've organized or orchestrated the events in Dagestan at this time. It could also mean that Russia is just an effective opportunist, leveraging the disorder for its own ends. That is entirely believable, that Russia is a scavenger on the smoking slag pile of chaos, a parasite feeding on human misery. Now, it's always a risk crediting your enemy with more strategic intent and wit than they possess. My bet is that Russia has a stake in the disorder. It fits with Russia's business model. Anything that weakens the West and the rules-based order is within its purview. Does Moscow fear chaos? No, only situations where it appears weak and cannot project power. Chaos abroad is fine, chaos at home, not so much. Russia also plays a win-lose game. But now that the violence is real, Putin cannot hedge his bets. He cannot back all the sides. The calculus must be that if Israel loses, then the US loses and Russia wins. You cannot entertain Hamas in Moscow, vocally support the Hamas objectives, if not the methods too, and still retain unfriendly relations with Israel. Putin still likely does not believe that Ukraine has agency in its fight against Russia, so that by distracting the US and its allies, harming their interests, it is also weakening Ukraine. That's according to their logic. Russian propagandists have explicitly been saying this. Every artillery shell that America provides to Israel is one less shell than it can provide to Ukraine. This strategy to leverage the crisis may be working, and the consequent muddying of the political and media waters. In the US, there are serious attempts by the GOP Speaker of the House to decouple Ukraine and Israel aid with the aim of freezing the former. This narrative will only get more prominent as Russia continues to see its fighting capability erode in Ukraine, as has been evidenced by the recent Avdiivka offensive, and we covered that in detail on another Silicon Bites episode. We will see more of these attempts to leverage informational warfare around the chaos in the Middle East. There is little doubt of that. Russia's strategic currency is immoral opportunism, throwing petrol on the flames of violence and chaos. But they don't care if it's someone else's house that burns down, whether that be in Gaza, Israel, Syria, Ukraine, Georgia, or Chechnya. It's notable that a recent Twitter post put out this morning by the Russian Foreign Ministry quotes Putin as saying that those behind the Middle East conflict and other regional conflicts will be using the destructive impact of these conflicts to sow hatred and cause clashes between people around the world. This is possibly one of the most blatant statements of projection I have yet seen from an official Twitter account controlled by Russia. But what about Dagestan? Well, this is a little closer to home for Russians than, say, Gaza is. And what do we know so far about it? For this bit, I'm going to be looking at Medusa.io and its recent coverage of the anti-Semitic unrest in Russia's North Caucasus. On the evening of October 29th, hundreds of Dagestan residents broke into the airport in the region's capital city, Makhachkala. Over the several hours that followed, rioters effectively took over the airport, broke through to the tarmac, and made their way to a plane from Tel Aviv, which they tried to storm in search of Israeli citizens. Of course, as we now know, fortunately, they failed to get into that aircraft. But the airport attack was the latest in a larger series of anti-Semitic incidents that have taken place in Russia's North Caucasus region in recent weeks. So how have the Russian authorities reacted? The anti-Semitic riot at the airport apparently came as a shock, inverted commas, to the Putin administration, and they considered it a total emergency for the president's team, reports Medusa from sources close to the Kremlin and the country's ruling United Russia Party. According to one person close to the Putin administration, at the beginning of the recent wave of anti-Semitic incidents in the North Caucasus, and despite the apparent alarm at the turn of events, officials and political strategists who work in the administration sent each other videos of Dagestan residents looking for Jews, inverted commas. They shared the clips just for laughs, the source explained. Although the series of anti-Semitic incidents across the North Caucasus has drawn condemnation, nonetheless, from Dagestan governor Sergei Melikov, nonetheless attributed the actions to false information spread by outside provocateurs. And at a major meeting with senior federal officials to address anti-Semitic rioting in Dagestan, Putin blamed foreign influence and denounced the US as a spider entangling the world. The fate of the world, Palestine included, he said, will be determined on the battlefield in Ukraine. So here, Putin himself has tried to explicitly link the violent events in Israel with those in Ukraine. In his mind, they may even be linked, but that does not yet prove that Russia played a role in orchestrating them. Again, opportunism, cynical opportunism by the Kremlin is just as likely. The Russian Investigative Committee has launched a criminal investigation into the riot, local officials said. Meanwhile, they've blamed the wave of anti-Semitic crimes on enemies influencing Russia from the outside. The Kremlin announced Monday that Vladimir Putin will hold a major meeting with top officials to discuss the situation. This, again, is classic projection onto your enemies. This is classic Russia aggressive victimhood. Blaming the Jews for their own misfortunes, saying that Ukrainians are firing rockets and shells at themselves. The conflicts are different, but Russian lies are the same. And here I've collated some rather insightful comments from experts on Twitter and other sources. And especially these comments address the fact that the police did not immediately act, suppress the riots. Time and again, Putin has used anti-Semitic tropes and anti-Semitic jokes, says this source, about Ukrainian President Zelensky and former Minister Chubais and many others. Many of you will also recall that Foreign Minister Lavrov slips barely disguised anti-Semitic tropes into many of his speeches. State propaganda blames Israel for Gaza, and Hamas is publicly welcomed in Moscow. In Makhachkala and elsewhere, everything is covered by police, riot police, military police, FSB, and other security services. Russia is drenched in security forces. So why did they act? And in Putin's Russia, they have the power to arrest anyone and seize anyone's assets. And yet, in the traditional law enforcement sense, they have very few responsibilities. They are not responsible for public order. Instead, in Putin's Russia, their sole responsibility really is to serve the lords and masters in Moscow. When the crowd started to gather at the airport, the police, riot police, military police, FSB, and others stood still, waiting for orders. But what orders? Local cronies, including the governor of the region where the airport is located, and he is, it happens, a former general, have read Putin's anti-Semitic insinuations very well. That in Putin's Russia, they do read Putin's mind, they do pay attention to his words. They would not move without getting the signal from Moscow. They would wait until they got clear orders. In Moscow, some police, military police, FSB generals, etc., get the information that in Dagestan there is a riot, a pogrom even. Well, they cannot go to Putin with this information directly. What would they tell him? You know, people understood your hints and insinuations against Jews. They kind of got the message about what is acceptable and what isn't. And they've interpreted these signals in this certain way. They're looking to lynch Jews. They can't go and make that linkage between Russian state policy and these local acts that are taking place. The people in Moscow, the strategic decision makers, live in a different world. They live in a world of Rothschild, Soros, Pandora conspiracies, a world of Nazis and malign outside influence orchestrated by the US. They would not understand the idea of a local organic pogrom or any kind of organic disturbance. So hours pass, crowds gather, they attack the airport, they seize buildings and the runway in search for Jews to lynch. Police, riot police, security forces stand by, awaiting orders from Moscow. Finally, those orders come through. Because in Moscow, some people responsible for monitoring what's going on discover through social networks and reporting by CNN, BBC, and others that there is a pogrom taking place in Dagestan. Now they can go to Patrushev and others, and they can say, look, here is a Rothschild, Soros, US-inspired attack on Russia. They're using our own people against us. This is something that the FSB, the paranoid FSB conspiracy-laden hierarchy understands. Of course, if the US is behind it, if Israel is behind it, if Ukraine is behind it, then they need to do something to stop it escalating. Putin gives orders to disperse the crowd and make arrest. Locally, police, riot police, FSB finally have orders, and they step in to disperse the crowds. They make a few arrests and generally put a dampener on everything that's going on. So is this the result of a dysfunctional system? Or is it far worse than that? Well, this is a topic discussed by Ksenia Kirilova in a SIPA article. We're going to put the link to this in the description of the video. And she asked the question, has the Kremlin's dream of global chaos come true? Putin, she writes, has anticipated and contributed to the breakdown of post-World War II order for many years. This has been his objective. Does the world's increasing stability mean that he is achieving those goals? Now, she writes, for many years, this effort was generally projected in quite a regional rather than a global way. As the Kremlin was preparing its full-scale invasion of Ukraine, she writes, its objectives expanded significantly. Russian authorities were banking on the idea that the bloody reshaping of the world would commence with its aggression in Ukraine. Russia hopes that war will become a norm even for Western countries. In this scenario of global conflict, they believe that a distracted West entangled in conflicts on other fronts will be unable to unite in the face of the Russian threat, let alone impose sanctions. Now, it hasn't panned out in quite the way that Russia thought. Russia is still emerging as one of the primary disruptors of the existing world order. It's leading to unprecedented chaos and impunity by authoritarian regimes around the world. But it has also led to something that Putin did not foresee, and that is the consolidation of Western countries against its aggression and in support of sanctions. But Russia, ever the opportunity, has managed to pivot from a disastrous war into something that actually props up the regime, that actually supports its business model. In this article, the author quotes various reporting that argues that the war and destruction have become the primary drivers of the Russian economy and facilitate the development of other sectors within Russia too. That includes propaganda, education, schools, brainwashing, pro-government organizations, and above all, terror. Above all, convincing people that they are isolated and alone and should not organize to resist the regime. The most compelling way to persuade the population of the necessity to exist in a state of extreme survival and readiness for war is to ensure that the rest of the world is similarly compelled to endure and engage in warfare. The article argues that in this context, propagandists will seize the opportunity to argue that the conditions in Russia are actually no worse, and perhaps even better than elsewhere. After all, look at all this chaos and violence. Of all the Kremlin's unfulfilled aspirations for global chaos, this one perhaps appears to be the most pragmatic and perhaps the most successful. It suggests that Moscow will persist in its efforts to maximize global destabilization, writes Ksenia Kirilova. And now we turn to another article, which actually has been widely shared by many pro-Ukrainians on Twitter and so on. It has, also to my relief, been shared by many people who are questioning the motives behind the article and its title. This is an article that appeared in Time. Again, we're going to put a link in the description of the video to this. Now, the article is gloomy. It has an air of defeatism about it. The article has a big red cover with a picture of Zelensky and the title, "Nobody believes in our victory like I do," inside Volodymyr Zelensky's struggle to keep Ukraine in the fight. Now, ostensibly, this is a pro-Ukrainian article, but it paints the struggle that country is undergoing in terms of an individualistic, lonely, great man narrative. Simon Schuster, the author, could be said to be undermining Ukrainians' fight for freedom, and that is how some commentators have been interpreting it. Others perhaps see a worrying trend within Ukraine, including the historian Sergei Radchenko, who writes, Zelensky's fears are real, I think. is not that a world war starts in Ukraine, but that this war becomes a protracted yet hopeless local affair, even as the West, tired and distracted, turns its attention elsewhere. A quagmire for Russia, a nightmare for Ukraine, just another war of the broken world. Again, ostensibly, that is not a narrative that is good for Russia. However, people losing hope in a Ukrainian victory, people resigning themselves to a forever war along frozen lines, that does benefit the Kremlin, and that has become a key part of their propaganda narratives. It seems to me that this Time article by Simon Schuster is a misrepresentation of reality, and we can only wonder why he has framed it in this way. Does it simply reflect a prevailing mood in Washington? Is it designed as clickbait, a gross simplification of a complex reality? Does it fall into the stereotypical trap of turning a complex situation into a simple tale of victims and heroes? The lonely, isolated leader who is above and beyond his people, full of conviction, but who is out of alignment with the times, morally unique and ahead of his people in some sense? Because this in no way reflects the reality of Ukraine. They are a people united as never before, with a common interest, common goals, and determination. But this article is not about the Ukrainian people. In fact, it does them a disservice by focusing the struggle through the lens of a single person. Does this, in fact, fit with an emerging Kremlin narrative? Now, this writer of the article has form of crafting stories through a Moscow-centric lens. I could be harsher still about his output and in judgment of his journalistic intent and motivations, but I will leave you to check it out. I'll leave you to look at some of his previous articles, which you can find online, to see whether he is entirely objective in his reporting of the Ukrainian-Russian war, not just since February last year, but going all the way back to 2014. Now, where could these distorted and potentially defeatist narratives lead? I believe there is a need to monitor the nuances of language and meaning. We need to search for patterns, repetitions, and amplification of angles through sources that are known to peddle Kremlin talking points or amplify their strategic directions. And what is this narrative likely to be? How will this unfold in the coming months? And how will it be amplified by Kremlin assets? We have to remember these are manufactured talking points. They do not represent reality. They're not supposed to. In fact, they are likely to be grotesque distortions of reality designed to undermine support for Ukraine. So the most common one, and the one that is really being leveraged at the moment, is that Ukraine cannot win, that Russia has infinite resources. So why carry on wasting your people, your material, your energy, your investments, etc., etc.? A narrative linked to that is that the war has reached a stalemate. This is one that we hear in the media over and over and over, and it is relatively lazy reporting. The counteroffensive, so this narrative goes, is a complete failure, hence why bother, etc., etc. And another one emerging in the chaos of the Middle East is that the West has more important conflicts to focus its attention and resources on. This is a dangerous line to be resisted. We see this reflected, unfortunately, in a lot of the talking points coming out of the presidential frontrunners in the US election, and we hear it said by the new Speaker of the House as well. But these narratives are linked. These narratives will gradually go further and further in what they're suggesting. The next level, I think, will be to suggest that Zelensky is out of alignment with his people and their interests, which is not true. I've spoken and met with many, many dozens of Ukrainians and not heard a single one of them suggest this idea. They may say they didn't vote for him originally before the war. They may say that corruption and nepotism and administrative inertia are still problems that need to be tackled. But broadly, Ukrainians are not out of alignment with their leader. An extension of this Kremlin narrative is that Ukrainians, gullible Ukrainians, are just proxies, dying for the US, dying for global interests, and the implication goes, dying for Jews. Russia and Russians are not responsible for the violence they unleash and provoke. This is another favorite one. We even hear this partly from some opposition figures. And as these narratives become more toxic and more weaponized and more conspiracy-laden, we also see a variant of them suggesting that the government of Ukraine and its economy is led and owned by a cabal of Jewish interests. This is the one to watch out for, conflating the conflict in the Middle East with what's happening in Ukraine. Again, it doesn't reflect reality. But this could get so much worse, and we should be prepared for it. Ukrainians are expecting the weaponization of global chaos and conflict. They know that this is how Russia operates, but it will take a toll on their and our mental health. So this is the time we need to offer Ukraine more support, more pushback against Russian lies, not less. And Russia may well try to leverage the anti-Semitism to drive a wedge between the Zelensky government and the people. I do not believe this will work, but it will lead to wide-ranging and toxic lies across social media, especially, I think, in Twitter. Zelensky is not an isolated and lonely leader. He knows his people. He's a comedian, an entertainer, an empathetic leader. He stayed because he understood it was reflecting his people's wishes and intent. We've all seen that video in the early hours of the invasion with him and his cabinet stating that they will not abandon Kiev. He stayed because he knew that the others would stay, the people would stay, and most would fight along with him. So painting him as an outlier, painting him as some unique individual with a unique perception of the situation and unique motivations is actually a dangerous narrative that distorts the reality. It's not in the interests of Ukraine. It's not in our interests either. But we need to examine another divisive topic, and this is anti-Semitism in Russia. I'm not going to go into huge detail. This will provoke a debate. It has provoked many comments on the channel, some saying, you know, they've lived and worked in Russia previously, they support Ukraine, but they don't recognize the points I was making, that actually anti-Semitism is rife, was rife, always has been rife in Russia, and was so in the 90s as well. Well, I'm going to point people towards a conversation that Yuri Dud, who is a very well-known interviewer, he is, I think, partly Ukrainian by extraction, and he interviews well-known people in Russia, long-form interviews, very in-depth. He's extremely shrewd and smart. And he recently had a conversation with two Russian celebrities, a husband and wife couple. She, I believe, is a singer. They do not come across well in this interview. Now, this interview is important, I think, to understand that there are many people in Russia and outside Russia as well, it has to be admitted, people who do not consider themselves to be anti-Semitic, but who create and amplify conspiracies that do have their roots in anti-Semitic tropes. This interview is a good example of that, and it's with Vika and Vadim Tsiganov, who both support the special military operation and the Russian army. But they think in hindsight that it may have been a mistake to launch the full-scale war at this time or without proper preparation. Note, they're not criticizing it on any kind of moral grounds. They're criticizing it because it is not working, although they can't overtly say that. So how do they get around this problem? How do they justify it to themselves, this overt, pointless aggression by Russia? Well, they say that actually the whole thing was a trap set up by shadowy global forces led by a military-industrial plot for hegemony, global hegemony, and of course that in some respect global Jewry is behind it as well. They go so far as to suggest that Putin was tricked into mounting the full-scale military operation. They claim that Putin was tricked of going into Bakhmut, into that meat grinder operation. They say the whole thing was actually intended to clear a vast swathe of land in the east as a precursor for a Jewish state in Ukraine's borderlands. Insane as this seems, and it is absolutely insane, it's clear the impulse to deflect any Russian responsibility for the war is actually part of a much more widespread trend amongst Russians. The inability to take responsibility, to have agency for what their government is doing, will manifest itself in many forms. This is perhaps one of the more outlandish and toxic of those. The events in Dagestan have also led some people to talk about the shape of things to come. And this is where we examine the Pandora's box effect of what may be happening in Dagestan. What is the shape of things to come in Russia? Well, one of the key things to focus on is that a weak, strong man is an oxymoron. But that is what we have in Putin. We have an authoritarian who is getting progressively weaker militarily and in terms of the force he can exert and the control he can exert on his own territories. Now, what Russians fear is revolution, but above all, they fear chaos. They fear the chaos of the rampaging mob. They fear looting. They fear destruction. These are all things that Putin has said he protects Russians against. And yet here in Dagestan, we see it being unleashed in a pogrom. But let's be realistic. We've not seen this kind of protest in almost 2 years of war and repression. So how likely is it now that the Russian people will rise up and oppose their government with the kind of force that we see in Dagestan, although in this instance, it is almost exclusively focused on Jew hunting rather than actually opposing their government? Well, I don't think this is the Kremlin's main fear. I don't think they fear revolutionary change from below. I also don't think they fear a palace coup, because until Putin significantly and visibly weakens, and until his grip on power is quite clearly at its lowest ebb, a palace coup is just as unlikely as revolutionary change from the bottom up. And that's because everyone now knows the fate of any conspirators against the Kremlin. It's dangerous, and those people invariably have fatal encounters with open windows. What is a far greater risk, and something I think which really guides a lot of the thinking of the Kremlin, is the disintegration of the imperial periphery. The airport pogrom shows the powerlessness of the state against real violence. And it was the same in Prigozhin's coup, where with the FSB, the riot police, the Siloviki, when Prigozhin's armored column was heading towards Moscow. They were nowhere to be seen. Now, when it comes to beating students and civilians, women and pensioners, well, they're fine with that. But armed mobs, not so much. This bully, coward mindset is entirely pervasive within the Russian Siloviki. And at this time, the army is stretched and largely deployed not to the border or the peripheral regions of the empire, but they are bogged down in Ukraine. So what does this mean for the potential disintegration of the imperial model? Well, for a start, we are already seeing the weakening of Moscow's cold, dead hand in the far-flung regions of Russia. We're seeing the emergence of states within a state. We're seeing impunity in Dagestan and Chechnya. This is the local rule of lawlessness, and local values are being imposed on people. And this is creating an atmosphere of impunity and semi-independence. Some of you will have seen the incident of Ramzan Kadyrov praising his son for beating a man in custody. And Moscow can do nothing to impose its writ upon these regions. What could Moscow do if one of these regions de facto declared independence? And something else you may have missed, and that is recently, in the last couple of days, Z patriots threatening Kazakhs for the opening of a US cultural liaison office in the capital. This is yet another sign that the influence of Moscow, the benefits of a close relationship with Moscow, are getting less and less clear for Russia's ex-colonial regions. The Z Patriot screams at a Kazakh podcaster and says, first we'll deal with Ukraine and then we'll come to sort you out. Who the hell do you think you are? So why is Moscow tolerating these states within a state? Why is it tolerating the suspension of the normal rules of the game in its outlying territories? Well, that is largely to encourage mobilization. It needs people to join the army. It needs people to come and fight in Ukraine. To an extent, in these republics with large Muslim minorities or even majorities, actually selling the war against Ukraine as the ability to fight US and Jewish influence actually may be quite attractive, a sort of jihad, if you were. But the Kremlin is treading a tightrope. They are keen not to provoke resistance to the war. They're keen not to see demonstrations. We'll also know that in Dagestan, perhaps some of the more vocal demonstrations against the war have happened in the last year or so. So they must be very mindful not to push things too far. Are we going to see mobs hunting Jews on the streets of Moscow and St. Petersburg as a result of this? Well, that's highly unlikely. But what we will see is the continuing erosion of Moscow's ability to project power across its internal empire. That is certain. Unpredictable and disconcerting violence around the world stoked by Russia. That is highly likely. And are we going to see unthinkable consequences within Russia itself as both the regime and the empire erode and destabilize? I think that is now an inevitability. But it'll not happen because of any moral outrage or democratic groundswell against the concept of empire in Russia. It will not happen because Russians abhor violence and disorder. The empire will not collapse as a result of that. The regime also will not collapse under the weight of its own irrationality or brutality. Russia will implode despite itself and despite the desires of its people. It will implode from weakness and impotence. This will not lead to a moral or democratic awakening. No flowering of liberal ideas of tolerance and equality, but a further metastasizing of the Russian world mindset, a sense of external and internal enemies, a sense of external and internal betrayal, bitterness for a lost empire, a vengeful and spiteful mindset, envious and hate-filled people. This is what awaits a Russian defeat, and this is what awaits the erosion of the Russian Empire. If Russians do not realize they're defeated, then the process of healing, rebuilding, and reassessment will not even begin. Much like in the 1990s when Russia did not consciously shed its Central and Eastern European empire out of any moral conviction or political idealism. Gorbachev may have thought of it in those terms, but very few Russians did. Very few Russians respect him or his legacy, and many bitterly resent their loss of power and status. How much worse will it be for them when they start to lose the territories of their internal empire? So from all this mess, what is the conclusion? Well, I think it's simple. There'll be much less chaos, much less uncertainty and violence in the world if we back Ukraine to win and we ensure that Russia is ejected from the entire territory of Ukraine.